All right, I'm going to start because I have a lot of material to get through, and I haven't really practiced it because I've been telling Alex McCaw not to practice his slides, so I had to not practice mine too. I'm really super excited to present about this stuff, so it's going to be really good. So my name is Fat. Some people call me Jacob, but that's wrong. It's Fat. You can find me on Twitter or on GitHub or some other places, weird places on the internet, and I usually have this handle, and if you say it, I might just respond to it. Be good. I work at a company in San Francisco called Twitter. We do the tweets, and it's pretty good. We have a booth. You should check it out. And there's really awesome people there that are hanging out, answering questions, talking about stuff that's cool. It's good. So what do? I write libraries. That's how I start all my talk. Just in case you were unclear, I do these things. They're called libraries. You probably heard of them. They're pretty good. So the libraries that I happen to work on, there's three that are kind of the most popular ones. One of them I'm going to talk about today, which is Bootstrap. And I work on that with the incredibly amazing designer, developer, engineer, rockstar, Mark Otto. It's pretty good. It's a pretty fun library. I also work on this library called Hogan.js, which is a mustache templating implementation. And I work on that with this guy named Rob Sayre, who's really, really amazing, but he started writing C++ lately again, and so I'm he's dead to me. He's not really. I actually really like that guy. Still, a little bit. And then this other library is called Ender, which is what I write with this guy named Dustin Diaz, and also Rod Veg, and they're both incredibly amazing engineers. You should check it out. It's a package manager. It's really cool. So usually I say that, and then the next thing I do is I'll talk about some books, because I read books, and it's a whole thing, and they're always really weird books, and everyone's like, oh, this is the book part. I always got to talk about some weird books. But not this time. Because instead of reading last weekend, I took a road trip, which is random, right? I decided to drive south with this guy named Alex McCaw, who's an O'Reilly author, and he's a pretty big deal here. Actually, if you went to the website, you might have seen him. It's pretty cool. He had a front thing on the website. Yeah, pretty crazy. But they spelled his name wrong, so I felt a little bit better. But I was still pretty self-conscious about it. Anyway, so we were like, let's drive south. This is going to be awesome. And we had really good intentions. Okay, we're going to drive south. We're going to work on our presentations. This is going to be so good. People are going to love that. We're going to have these amazing stories to tell, and they'll just translate perfectly to our presentations, and we'll practice them. But we drove so far south that we ended up at Disneyland, which turns out it's hard to make comparisons between Disneyland and JavaScript nerds. But also, holding it down right there. Oh my gosh. So we're in Disneyland, and I was asked to come here and talk to you about Bootstrap. And we stood in lines, and I was like, oh, Alex, I've got to think of something really creative that's going to be engaging and have something to do with Bootstrap, and I'll have this story arc and be really great. And we were standing through all these lines, and nothing was really coming to me until I was done with the whole thing. And then there was just one kind of idea that was kind of weird, and it was almost like something. It's an idea that kind of operates at the subconscious level, which is the importance of perception at Disneyland, which is one of the most important things maybe of the entire Disneyland experience. And so if you don't know what I'm talking about, there's a number of things they do which are really crazy and really actually pretty interesting. One's this thing called forced perspective. So the castles look super tall because they use big bricks and then slightly smaller and slightly smaller, slightly smaller. So it looks like everything's really tall. And then they have these really incredible sound engineers who put speakers throughout the entire conference. It's really crazy. Not conference. Yes, Disneyland, the conference. We were talking about how amazing Disneyland.js would be, and O'Reilly, if you're listening, step up, because Disneyland.js would be so incredible. But no, there's speakers everywhere throughout the theme park, and you don't even know where they are at all. You're just oh my God, it sounds amazing right here. I have no idea why, because the actual speaker is a rock or a fern or something really crazy, and you're like, what is this? It's amazing. And so I started to think about that, and I started to think about it in relation to Bootstrap. Like, what is the perception of Bootstrap? Or maybe more importantly, like, what should this perception be? Like, what should we be really focusing on? And I got an email from Peter Cooper, and he asked me, he said, Jacob, you wrote this thing called Bootstrap, and everyone thinks of Bootstrap as this glorified style sheet and HTML template. He used those exact words, and he's like, but it's not, right? There's JavaScript. I've seen there's like a directory. It's a whole thing. There's probably JavaScript in there somewhere. You should talk about the JavaScript, and you should change the perception. And at first I was like, well, yeah, because it's mostly what I work on. Maybe it'd be good if people knew about it. And then I was kind of starting to think, maybe it's actually really important that it's thought of as a glorified style sheet. And so, to explore that idea, I'm going to talk a little bit about history of Bootstrap in particular. And I'll try to make this brief because it's boring, I know. So 9 months ago, we did our first public release of Bootstrap. And it was pretty exciting. We were like, we had no idea what we were doing. We just were like, oh, I hope people like this thing. And we wrote this. I remember writing this introduction with Mark Otto, who's, again, amazing. I wish he was here. And he was like, oh, we'll write this thing. And it says, Bootstrap is a Twitter toolkit for kickstarting CSS for websites, blah, 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 lots of CSS-y CSS stuff. And then, basically, the idea was, oh, it's a library for kickstarting CSS, and that's what it is. That's exactly what it was. And we were pretty clear about it. It was good. Actually, in the beginning, it was really only modern CSS, too. It didn't even have IE support when we first launched it. And people, for the most part, loved it. I mean, there were some people like, oh my gosh, you don't have IE support? Like Dalton trolled me and some other people. So that was fine, but people mostly really liked it. And one thing that was really important, I thought, was Bootstrap began as just like a single asset. It was just CSS. It was nothing more. It was just a single CSS asset. And that was something that I actually personally thought was really awesome, because there have been so many UI libraries and so many different things, and they'd all been like all these images and all this crazy stuff, but this was just CSS. It was awesome. 29 days later, we released this thing called 1.3. We were working like crazy speeds, like no sleep for 29 days, and then 1.3 is released. And during this time, a lot of different people had been like, we'd provided modals and like tooltips and a bunch of other things, but we hadn't really provided any JavaScript to use them. And so I wrote these 7 plugins that kind of helped get people started. And at the time of writing them, I was really afraid that it was like the biggest mistake. I was like, oh, this is the end of Bootstrap's like legacy. The legacy was like 20 days. It's the worst thing ever. This is going to be just totally awful. And when we released it, we decided to keep the README exactly the same. Bootstrap is for kickstarting CSS. And that's because we still really fundamentally wanted it to be just for kickstarting your CSS. We wanted it to be like inherently simple, and the JavaScript was only really provided as a minimum requirement to kind of get you through the like pain points if you weren't really comfortable with JavaScript. And it was really nothing ever meant to be anything more than that. So when I wrote the plugins, I did it in a pretty kind of classical approach to writing plugins. What I mean by that is I basically went to jQuery UI, and I was like, these guys are probably doing something right. jQuery UI. I've heard of that before. So I copied and pasted and was like, look at all this code. Oh, it's so much. It's really good, but it's like so much. This is just supposed to be a CSS library. So I just like deleted massive amounts of it and tried to simplify it as much as possible. But it was still really meant to be used as a JavaScript library. There's still a JavaScript API. You did like $ some selector and then like called alert or something on it. And ultimately, this kind of bothered me. Like, this wasn't what I really wanted. Like, I don't know. It just didn't feel right. So about 3 months later, we start working on what we call 2.0. And this was really exciting because there's this guy on Twitter named Chris, who's our open source guy. And he was, a long time ago, he explained what semantic versioning actually meant to me. And it basically means that when you change the first number, you can just go crazy, like super crazy, and change everything. And so I was like, oh yes, I'm going to fix everything, delete all the plugins, I'm going to rewrite them, I'm going to add weird things, it's going to be awesome, everyone's going to be freaking out, I'm going to love it. And so I do that. I literally delete all the plugins, and I start from scratch, and I rewrite them, as well as a few new ones for some new components. And I end up with 12 new plugins. A lot of them had like the same name, but they're totally different. They're completely different. There's like alerts and carousels and all kinds of that junk. And while I do that, I also, of course, like remove features and options aggressively. I just want these things to be as simple as possible. But the absolute most important thing that I did was I added this data API, which was like so important to me. And the main reason was because I wanted people to stop writing JavaScript. Like I wanted the perception to just be amplified even more that what this is really a CSS library, and that the JavaScript is just in support of you doing these like really simple things. And that is actually a pretty fundamentally different approach to many existing UI toolkits. Like a lot of people, almost everything, it seems like, at least in my experience, has been they start with JavaScript and they go from there. So like YUI, it seems to be doing that. jQuery UI, of course. I mean, it's a JavaScript like focus library. And so another thing I did while doing that was not just make available the data API, but I actually tried to make JavaScript API like a second-class citizen. So when I started thinking of features and I started thinking of how plugins and things like that worked, I tried to think about them in terms of the data API implementation before I even thought or even cared about the JavaScript implementation. And this is still kind of weird, and it's a hard way. It's like a really strange way to like change your brain to think about things. But I like it a lot. It's actually kind of cool. And so what are some of the reasons why that is important, or like why that's even good, or like why anyone would ever want to do that? Besides just like me wanting to like keep the perception that it's everything simple. So the first thing that I thought of was like, well, there's a really good separation of form and function, and I don't even know if that makes sense, but it came to me when I was writing the slide. And basically what I mean by that is, for example, I'll do this by way of example. Mark Otto, he works at Twitter. He wrote like a large portion of this library. Incredibly amazing. And his day-to-day job is literally HTML, CSS, like, and he crushes it. He does an amazing job. But we want to be able to enable him to like get the majority of functionality and UI stuff done without having to write any JavaScript, because that's not his jam. Like, he gets stressed out when he has to write that stuff. And so implementing an API where every single time he wants a new dialog or every single time he wants a tooltip, he has to write like a line of JavaScript, it doesn't work. It doesn't scale, because that means every single UI needs a JavaScript developer to be a part of it, even if what he's trying to execute is just so fundamentally simple. And so with a data API, we actually enable that. We'll allow him to just say, oh, this is like, this button triggers like a dialog, or this button does this, or like this thing has this type of functionality, and we can just like subscribe to that functionality through data attributes in HTML. It's also a lot harder for people to get in trouble, because JavaScript actually, it turns out, is like really hard. You'd think it'd be easy because like I'm so stupid, and like JavaScript is like, I'm okay at it, so it should be the easiest thing. But there's so many really, really, really weird things that you can get in trouble with so easily. And almost the bulk of all of the JavaScript GitHub issues are never about, it's very rarely like, oh, I used the data attribute API and it didn't work how I expected. It's more like, I was doing this horrible, like, nightmarish thing with JavaScript, and I was using some weird outdated tools, and like all this crazy stuff, and something explodes. It's almost always that. And so moving people and like trying to push people towards data API will actually has actually affected the amount of JavaScript issues that we're getting. It's also a little bit less memory intensive, and this is kind of like not that big of a deal, but it's mostly, and if you're like really awesome at JavaScript, this is probably not a problem for you at all. But like a lot of noobs like me, or a lot of designers, or people that are using Bootstrap that aren't really like necessarily the best web developers, that are just using it to like get something out the door, they have a tendency to like, they'll be like, oh, I have this collection of like 500 button elements inside a table. I'll just call buttons on them or something. And without really realizing that just attaches like 500 JavaScript instances to like each individual thing, instead of just doing something really simple with data attributes, which would just like set up event delegation, and you'd have a single instance. This is way easier. Come on. So the last little why thing is server-side rendering. So we had a blog post at Twitter the other day where we were like, oh, server-side rendering is really cool, it's the bee's knees, and then we did that Tina Turner dance. It's like this, but I only have one hand doing it. It was really good, and the internet thought that it was okay. And this actually, it's really great for that because the way that we're doing delegation with the data API, we can change the DOM around and do a bunch of crazy stuff, and it just all works. We don't have to do anything. It's really nice. So the data API that we have looks something like this currently, which is data, verb, and then a plugin. So it would be something like blah, blah, blah. Here, hold on. Here's an example. So you'd say data toggle a modal, and then you would target which modal on the page using href hash, or you can do data target if you want to pass like a more advanced selector that's not an ID or something. And it's pretty straightforward. It's really easy. It's pretty good. All right, now back to history. So we do that, and I think through this data API, and we release 2.0. We actually have the first Bootstrap event that we ever had, and it was at the Twitter office, and it was really cool, and I was so nervous. I was almost as nervous as I was talking to this little thing. And so I was really excited, and we release it. And again, we keep the README exactly the same. It's still all about kickstarting your CSS. And it's still all about style sheets and really HTML templates. That's still the perception of Bootstrap. And again, I think that's really important. And I also want to iterate that it's not that you can't do really powerful things with the JavaScript. So as I was kind of talking this idea for this presentation through with a friend, and she's like, oh, well, so you just took all the JavaScript functionality away, like, woo, cool presentation, bro. And I was like, oh, no, it's good, hold on. Because Bootstrap's JS is like in the same way that we try to make the less really extensible. You can do crazy stuff with the JavaScript if you know what you're doing. Like the first thing you can do, turn off the data API. Like if you don't like it, that's cool. Just we use jQuery's named events. Just remove that. No big deal. You can set your own defaults, which is a pretty common plugin thing. You can actually, we expose the raw constructors. You can get really crazy, subclass modules, start doing mix-ins, doing all that kind of really nerdy stuff if you're into that. I wrote like a Facebook-style tokenizer on the type ahead in like 20 lines of code. It was really easy because there's subclassed it. It was awesome. You can also retrieve raw plugin instances straight off of elements after they've been instantiated and like play around with the options and do all kinds of crazy stuff, mix in more methods to just a single instance. You can listen to custom events, blah, blah, blah. It's not very exciting. You can also prevent default execution on most of the custom events now, which will like stop something from happening. So if you had, for example, what would you have? Oh, on show, do this. And then you'd be like, oh, I don't have the data, like don't show, something like that, and I don't know. So this is all there. And it's really good. There's a lot you can do. It's pretty exciting. But I don't want your thought to be like, oh, I should use it because it's there, and I see it. And he like talked about it, so it's like a thing. I'm going to use it. People are going to love it. Instead, I want you to get like as far as you can without you don't even worry about it. It should be really easy. And you should just go forth without the JavaScript if you can. And that's why when I was thinking more about this perception thing, I was thinking it was really important that it was just thought of as like a CSS like simple tool. And then, so this is me going back through the commit history. And then in 2.0, we actually did change the README. We changed it to this. And also notice, get the Travis in there, pro style at 2.2. So we actually start to mention JavaScript. And we go on to say, blah, blah, blah. It's really good. JavaScript interface components, front-end toolkit. It's great. But perhaps it was a mistake to mention HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So I just went on saying like, oh, we did all this work to keep it like to be thought of as just a CSS library. Like maybe that's the wrong way, and maybe it was a mistake. And as I was writing these slides, I was thinking like, oh, what have we done? Like this is not right at all. But I don't actually necessarily think that having CSS or HTML template is the right kind of way to think of Bootstrap either. And instead, I kind of want to suggest that the new end goal kind of as the introduction that I want to have and the direction I want to see Bootstrap going is more towards this like popular interface components and interactions, which is like a little fragment of the current README. And so as I thought that through, I was like, well, you know, everything right now is like not really like that. The web's not really into this sort of thing. And like there's like all this, it's like very important to say, you know, what technology you're using, etc. And so like how do we get to this place where we can just say it's like user interface components? And then, on the internet, this is like some crazy luck. There's like a lot of luck involved. There's a working draft spec released about this thing called web components, which is so cool. I don't know. Who in the room has heard of web components? Oh, all bosses. Everyone in the room at the end will know, though. It's so crazy cool. So web components, there's like really 4 new things that are a part of this spec. And it's this thing being pushed forward by Google, this bro named Dimitri, and I think there's a guy named Dominique or something. Anyways, it's 4 dudes. Or not 4 dudes, 4 things. Templates, decorators, custom elements, and this really cool sounding thing called the Shadow DOM, which is just like the neatest sounding name ever. I was like, oh, I'm going to like this. It's going to be awesome. And so what this spec is really all about is being able to define isolated and encapsulated widgets. So what does that even mean? It just basically means you're able to make components and like kind of lock them down a little bit and export them as like widgets. And it's really awesome, and I like it a lot. And last night I was having a few drinks with some people from Twitter, Todd Klutz, and this guy named Kenneth, and Dan Webb, Ben Ward, amazing Ben Ward. And they were like, oh, that's really similar to this thing called IE behaviors after I was describing it. And I was like, what's this? And then they started laughing, and they did like talk to like some British stuff. They're like mostly all British. And they started talking about Dean Edwards, and then I like zoned out. And then last night I went home and I Googled it a little bit, and it mentioned something about HTC, and I was just like, oh, I don't even want to read about this. So I didn't. But if you know about it and you want to tell me about it later, that'd be cool. I mean, yeah, HTC. So what I do know is that the web component spec does not use HTC. It uses HTML, which is really awesome because I know what HTML is and it doesn't stress me out. So how does this work? How does this web component thing work? How is it going to change the world? How is it going to change Bootstrap? Why am I even excited about it? I don't know. I'm going to tell you. Custom elements. So custom elements is a thing that I'm most excited about, actually. And it kind of involves everything else. So I thought it was a good place to kind of really give you a glossy explanation of what it is. Custom elements allow you to define new components, basically. And they do it in a pretty cool way. So it looks a little bit like this. You define a new element. You say it extends something. So this, for example, I'm doing a Bootstrap button, extends the regular button, and you give it a name. So the first time I saw this, I think I stood up and I looked around my apartment for a table that I could flip over, but I couldn't find one because I live in the Tenderloin. We don't have tables in the Tenderloin. And the reason I was really mad, there's a couple reasons. The first reason, and they were all addressed. I'll let you know about them. So the first thing I was like, extends button. I was like, why can't I just say this is my cool new button? What is this business all about? The extends button thing is actually really cool. So what it does is it makes your new custom element inherit from an element which is already defined in HTML. And this gives you a bunch of advantages mostly around accessibility, or at least that's the one that I saw that I was like, oh, that makes a lot of sense, actually. That's kind of awesome. So rather than just starting from 0 when you're defining a new element, you get to start from something which already has at least a little bit of accessibility, so you're not completely starting over every single time. The next thing that kind of frustrated the crap out of me was this X dash in the beginning. I was like, oh, how is that actually made it into the spec? But this guy, Dimitri, who's putting this whole thing on, he's also stressed out about it. He's really emo, and he made a bunch of issues about how he's going to fix it and some ideas. So hopefully that changes. You never know. Hopefully it does, though. So this is what it would look like. So say I had just defined my Bootstrap button, and it was awesome, and it had all the Bootstrap things, and it was really good. And then you would actually create a button that looked a little bit like this. You'd say button, and then you say it is my, whatever I named it, and then you'd have a button, and it would have a bunch of cool functionality. It'd be really awesome. So it's really simple. But now you're saying well, that didn't make a lot of sense, probably. And that's because inside of the element tags, there's all this magic is happening. All the really cool, actually interesting stuff happens. And I'm going to talk about it, and I'm going to blow your mind. And Brendan Eichel will fall out of his chair. So here's what happens. So the first thing is script elements inside the element tag are executed with a different context. And this blew my mind a little bit at first, because I was like, that's so dumb. And then I was like, whoa, that's really cool, actually, because you can do really, really crazy things with it. I want to explain them to you. So the this of the script, when it's embedded inside of an element, is no longer the window object. It's actually this, or it might be some weird augmented window object, but I don't think so. I think it's the actual element itself. And you get a couple interesting things that are like available to you. The first one is this thing called a generated constructor. So this thing is just crazy, but basically what you can do is let's see, where's the best place to start beginning explaining? Oh yeah, so if you think back to the element tag, if you were to add a constructor property to this tag and name it, for example, Bootstrap button or alert or whatever you wanted to name it, you can actually that will actually put a variable onto the actual window object that you can then instantiate by doing like new like alert or new whatever, and it'll give you an instance of that element, and then you can like inject it into the DOM or do whatever you want, which is crazy. But you probably don't want to add like stuff to the window like that. It's kind of weird. So you can actually just use this generated constructor property. So you can do this.generated constructor, and that will actually equal the constructor. And then you can add things to the prototype of this. This is where it gets crazy. You can do this.generated constructor.prototype.close, for example. Like say you're building an alert, or not alert, like say you're building an alert thing, an alert box or something, and you want a little close button. You can define on the generated constructor's prototype this close button, and if anywhere else in your app, you select that element. Say you're using jQuery, you do like $select this alert thing, then bracket 0, so you're like accessing the raw element object. It would have the close method defined on it, and you could actually just close the freaking button, which is crazy. So awesome. So you can imagine a world where all your elements were augmented with these basically all your elements were just JavaScript objects and really logical and made sense and were really powerful and crazy and awesome. And then there's these two other things which are kind of weird and took me a while to kind of figure out. The first is this thing called lifecycle, which is, it's kind of like, there was that observer spec that went on a while ago, and I think they might actually change the lifecycle to just use that. But basically, they want you to use lifecycle to like look after whether or not an element's been inserted or removed into the DOM or an attribute's been changed or anything like that. And then listen is a new kind of event listener, which has like all these crazy like event delegation built into it and a bunch of crazy stuff. And I think it's because the way that the event model has been spec'd out is like really, really complicated with these new things. And so they're like freaking out about the shadow DOM and like what happens to events, like do they go out of here, like what's the context of them and all this stuff. So I think they came up with this new listen thing. I'm not exactly sure. I still have questions about it, and I haven't talked to anyone yet. But it's going to be good. So what else is inside the element? There's this new template thing, which is crazy. So a template is actually a document fragment. And if you're probably familiar with the document fragment, you use it basically anytime you insert a bunch of crap into your DOM. So say you have 50 or so odd elements and you want to insert them. Rather than inserting one at a time, usually you'll create some sort of document fragment and then put them inside that and then just insert the document fragment. And then it's just one insertion. You're like, woo, awesome. That's basically what template is, and it's really cool. And you can use it to create shadow DOMs and all kinds of really awesome stuff. And they also provide you this content tag, which is totally crazy. So earlier, like when we had the button thing, say it was an element that you could actually embed content within, you can use the content tag to kind of like make the template more templatey in that it actually accepts different content. And it has this select property. Oh my gosh, it's crazy. You've got to look into this. It's really crazy. And then there's also this, which is basically the last thing I would kind of want to talk about in relation to this stuff, which is scoped styles. So you can add a scope property to a style, and it's scoped to like an element. It's pretty awesome. It's really simple, and it should have been there forever. And it's going to make things really amazing, particularly for third-party developers and stuff like that. So all of this has to go inside an element tag. And the first time you kind of think of that, you're like, oh, like that's so much crap. That's like the worst idea for a spec. And you get like really bummed out, or at least I got bummed out. I was like, oh, this is going to be so bad. But it turns out it's actually really, really awesome, because the more I thought about it, the more I was like, this is going to change everything. Like everyone should be freaking out about this. This is the most incredible thing ever, because for the first time in a really long time, we're able to include CSS, HTML, and JavaScript all in the same asset. So they're also, as a part of this spec, we have this new rel components. And so imagine if Bootstrap was able to actually come back and be a single asset someday. Come back and be this single component entity where instead of including, oh, here's my like whatever CSS, and then here's my JavaScript asset, and it doesn't have semicolons and it's stressing me out, and then here's my HTML that I've like copied and pasted from the DOM. Like, what if that was all brought together and all packaged together for you in this really simple, incredibly easy to use API where you were literally just like button is Bootstrap button, and it had all the JavaScript, it had all the CSS, it had all the HTML, it looked beautiful, it worked just kind of how you'd want it to work, and it was all there, and it's, that's so crazy. Like, that is like the craziest thing happening on the web. It's amazing. I just can't wait for that to happen. And so that, if you think about it, is, for me, like, that's how you get back to these like popular user interface components and interactions. That's how you get back to this like idea, or like this, what was the word? Whatever. Not perspective. Perception. That's how you get to the perception that Bootstrap is just this component model, and it's not just JavaScript, or it's not just CSS anymore. It's these like things which I use, and this very, so good. And then I found a picture of Jake the dog from Adventure Time that looked kind of like how I feel at night when I think about it. And I was like, this is perfect. And then also I'm just going to touch on one last thing, just a little teeny tiny bit, which is, I don't have any slides for it, but the more I thought about this, when I was doing the Jake the dog, like, longingly staring into the stars thing, I started to think about like how important this was for package managers, and particularly for the web. So I mentioned in the beginning that I had worked on Ender, and then I'm also working on a new project with Alex McCaw that is not yet known really that much about, but it's also a package manager. And one thing that we've been thinking a lot about is how do we distribute things really amazingly well on the front end? Like, we have NPM as kind of this shining star example for Node, and like how you can do JavaScript really well, and everyone's first thought is, oh, NPM is so awesome for JavaScript. The front end is like, there's JavaScript there, it's got to be the same. But it's really, there's a fundamental like shift, which is there's all these other assets that you need to worry about, and like, how do you map them and all that stuff? And I really, truly think that web components is like the way you map them. Like, the future is packaging all our libraries and packaging everything up into HTML, a single HTML file, and distributing that component. And it's going to change everything. It's going to be it's like super crazy. Anyways, that's it. Follow Fake Angus because he's funny and he needs to tweet more. And if you follow him, maybe he'll do that. Thank you. Is there any questions or any insults, slanderous, anything? No? You want me to put hip-hop back on?
Oh, I have a question.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, what's like the browser support, like in the future? Obviously right now it's like Chrome 90 or whatever, but is that something is Firefox and other vendors?
Yeah, so I've only been looking into this a little bit. I don't know if Paul Irish is here, and maybe I can like call him out. But basically, what I found so far is that the browser support is not awesome at all. There's a lot of really smart people looking on the spec, and it's developing, and they're trying to figure things out. The Chrome Nightlies has, or not Nightlies, the Canary Chrome thing has, what's it called, Shadow DOM implemented and like the scoped CSS styles, but they're still working on a lot of the other stuff, particularly around events, which is really, really complicated. I think a patch just landed in Chrome for that. And then also they're working on 2 shims, I believe, which will let you kind of play around with this stuff. The guy Dimitri, I think he's hosting one, and there's another guy from Mozilla who I'm totally spacing on his name because I'm a jerk, but he's also pretty awesome. And so hopefully, not only will they have like this stuff start to come out in browsers, but they'll be really amazing shims, so we'll be able to actually start using this in like a real way in older browsers. So yeah, does that answer your question, kind of? Cool, sweet. Yeah, go ahead.
So it looks like it's a sync one button component for request. Is that correct?
I'm not. Well, so I think it should be, at least if you package your stuff. So the way that I saw most of the examples done in the spec was almost everything was done in an inline way almost. So I imagine there'll be some sort of, we'll develop some sort of tool for like building and compressing this stuff in a really incredibly advanced way. And then I imagine these sort of things, yeah, like CSS, it'll be like a tricky way of bundling like CSS and JavaScript together as like a single thing. I'm sure there'll be awesome hacks around that or something. Is that cool? Yep, sweet. But you should definitely follow up with someone who's way smarter than me on that, because I could totally be completely lying to you. Any other questions about this stuff? Or alternatively, if you're like not into the public question answer sessions, you can find me and I'll be hanging out in the Twitter booth probably, or like wandering around. There's Beer.js. Oh, and there's a Twitter drinking thing tomorrow night. If you're into that, you can also hang out. That would be awesome, and I'd love to meet you guys. Oh, another question. What's up? So I don't necessarily, I'll try to repeat the question, and then you tell me how badly I'm butchering the question. Is that fair? So if people are using web components, there could be lots of, is it like unanticipated rendering things because people are using Shadow DOM or something? Is that what you're thinking? Okay. And so like how do you control that and make sure someone's not making like 1,000 divs in your thing and it's really scary? And then how do you make sure the performance of that's not really awful? Is that good? Besides just simply not using it. That is a good question. So something that I didn't really talk about that I did mention a little bit was, there's a slide, I can't remember. It was like encapsulation and something else they call it. But basically how the Shadow DOM works is it's pretty locked down. So there's going to have to be, at least as far as I'm aware, there's going to have to be a certain level of kind of like you knowing what's going on, because these DOM elements aren't traversable in the regular DOM. You can access them through CSS and like style them differently and stuff, but that wouldn't necessarily help you with performance any. So yeah, I'm not sure, unfortunately. I'm sorry. But let's see. Someone might, no, I don't know. Someone smart might be able to answer that. I have no idea. Any other questions? We're good? All right, great. Thank you guys so much. Cheers.